Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. Today's guest is Mitch Friedman. Mitch Friedman is an American conservation biologist and activist who founded the organization Conservation Northwest in 1989. Frustrated with the tactics and strategies of the Earth First movement in the 80s, he began developing new perspectives and programs for preserving wildland and wildlife. This is part 2 of our interview, in which we will further discuss his new book, Conservation Confidential, A Wild Path to a Less Polarizing and More Effective Activism. Welcome back, Mitch.
Thank you, Glenn.
Would you like to make introductory comments before I begin my new questions in the light of our last conversation?
No, let's jump in.
Okay. I would like to get clear about your overall vision of a healthy and sustainable movement. You said last time that you do not have a problem with the value and worth of the 1964 Wilderness Act. In fact, you said that you are a big supporter of wilderness. Are you in favor of removing the compromises that were made to get the bill passed into law, such as grazing within wilderness borders?
I haven't given a lot of thought to that. There's certainly designated wilderness areas that I think are better off without livestock, and there are places where there are designated wilderness areas where we have been able to get livestock removed, purchasing from permittees grazing rights, and the land has improved. I guess the way I feel about it, Glenn, is I'm not sure that that's the priority.
Mm-hmm.
I think with virtual fencing, we're finding ways to improve stewardship of livestock. And, we've just got more important things to do for biodiversity than kind of the purity agenda that I think you're referring to with those compromises.
Okay, so you may have just answered the second question. I think you have, but I'll state it here. What about inholdings or private parcels of private land that exist within wilderness boundaries?
Yeah, those can be tough. The owners of inholdings sometimes leverage extraordinary payments through threat of mining or McMansion development. I certainly support Land and Water Conservation Fund and public land.
All right. I know you are in favor of wilderness in swamps, desert, mountains. And I think you said last interview that we also need wilderness in meadows, grasslands, river valleys, shrubland, prairies. I'm sure you know that only about 2 to 3% of the land in the lower 48 states is designated wilderness. Are you in favor of expanding the wilderness preservation system? And if so, do you have any ideas or feelings about how big it should be?
We might have a misunderstanding there, Glenn. I'd be more concerned with wildness or naturalness or ecological function than wilderness in the way I think you use the term for a lot of those landscapes. I definitely am in strong favor of conservation and restoration and managing for ecological resilience. But that managing term is key. If that can be done with a wilderness designation, managing fire and, trying to perpetuate historic disturbance patterns with a wilderness designation, that's great. But I don't know that wilderness is the best tool to achieve the ecological objectives in every case.
Okay. I asked you last time about the work of Michael Soule, Reed Noss, David Parsons, and other conservation biologists who argue that we need to set aside half the land and water as wilderness to sustain at least 90% of biodiversity. I believe you said last time that this science doesn't hold up. Is that your view?
I think this is where we got cut off on our last call. So it's a challenging one, and I know Harvey Locke is doing great work along those same lines, the half-Earth argument. I think where it turns is whether wilderness and sort of that pure, untrammeled by man standard is the best way to conserve that 50%. I would argue that much of that 50%, many of those ecosystem types that need more conservation are, more efficiently protected or conserved through not wilderness, but through naturalness, through Aldo Leopold's land ethic. A thing is right when it tends to, perpetuate or improve the ecological function of the land. Wilderness, and it's an exclusionary concept, I don't think is the right tool for many of those landscape types that had 12,000 years of very active presence and engagement and coevolution with, human management.
Okay. Now, I realize these are big and difficult questions, so I appreciate your comments on them. Setting aside the issue of whether or not the best available science demonstrates this half-wild perspective, what is your objection to it? In other words, why not embrace the planetary ideal of half the Earth for humans and half the Earth for the other 10 to 20 million non-human species?
I think it's a distraction. I think we've made great progress in conservation in the Northwest, and we've added to lands protected by wilderness in Washington. But I would argue that our biggest strides forward in biodiversity conservation, our most efficient progress, has not been through wilderness. I mean, why do we obsess about changing the color on maps of more mountaintop acres when we've got more urgent biodiversity needs in the valleys? Mm-hmm. I suppose that's my problem, this notion that every acre of wilderness, designated strict wilderness, moves us rapidly towards some ecological panacea. I don't think that's true at all. I think we need landscape conservation. I think we need better conservation and restoration and ecosystem conservation of all types of ecological areas. Mm-hmm. And this notion that saving more of the wild mountains moves us towards, more sustainability or better biodiversity conservation, I don't think is true.
Okay. You say in your book, quote, "I think the binary model of wild and not wild is a dangerous allure that can foster sentiments of misanthropy." Why do you say this?
Well, I see it a lot. I mean, people are understandably upset and afraid of the future. With climate change and biodiversity loss, there's, a lot not going right in the world. And it's easy just to say people are the problem and that the solution is non-people. And you see that applied not just in backcountry. Often people think that the answer to, people are protecting land in urban areas. And, as human exclusion. Is that the right way to solve our problems? I don't know. I think it's a simplistic notion that, yes, we need wild areas, but we also need a lot of nature that is not in wilderness, that is not strictly wild, a lot of nature that can handle a certain amount of human presence and even benefits from it because it's co-evolved. The biodiversity there is co-evolved with human perpetuated disturbance. So I think we burn up a lot of political capital. We distract ourselves with romantic notions. We built a movement around the notion of ecological purity that can tend towards misanthropy. And I don't think it's best for the health of our movement and the success of our movement and effective conservation at the needed scales.
As for myself, I think just the opposite. That is to say, I think the attempt to overcome the binary model of wild and not wild is the real danger, because it has led to the near total humanization of the planet, entailing this sixth extinction.
I think if you were to map the extinctions, it's not a neat overlap with, wild and not wild. For instance, in the Northern Rockies, the icon, the symbol, the rallying cry for protecting vast wilderness in, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, have been grizzly bears. And we've not achieved that vast wilderness. We have a lot of it. But if you look at the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, for 30 years, there's been campaigning for that because we need it to save the grizzly bear. Grizzlies have, meanwhile, been increasing in numbers and range quite well in the Northern Continental Divide and around Greater Yellowstone and in other areas. Grizzlies don't necessarily need wilderness. They need to not be shot. And if we're fighting other political constituencies over wilderness, rather than trying to find the common ground of how best to allow grizzly bears and wolves and other wildlife to survive and thrive, then I think the binary is working against the biodiversity objective.
I think the underlying assumption or premise, if you like, of your book is that human activities can and should improve wilderness, including enhancing biodiversity in most places. Is this a fair interpretation of your book?
No, there's a terminology there where you will use the word wilderness. Remember, I do support designated wilderness, the Wilderness Act, in certain landscape types where that's historically supported, where people and their influence was rare and minimal in pre-colonial times. You know, I guess that's about all I can say on that.
Okay. Well, let me elaborate on this a little bit. If we have plenty of time here. I'm sure you could point to places where human activities have increased biodiversity. But when you look at what humans have done to the earth overall, across our history, I don't see much empirical evidence for this claim that human activities can increase biodiversity.
Yeah, the objective isn't to increase biodiversity. The objective is to sustain it, to perpetuate the ecological conditions that over, long time periods have fostered biodiversity. In a lot of cases, you need heterogeneous landscapes. We talk about how natural fire creates a mosaic on the land, a variety of habitat types that support, a more natural range of biological diversity, and also tends to break up the landscape so it doesn't have mega fire. The types of giant fires that we're seeing more of these days that are a big concern. That landscape heterogeneity is maintained by active fire. That's how Indians did it for 12,000 years. We made a huge screw up for a century of taking an opposite approach of excluding fire. That's when I talk about maintaining biodiversity compatible with human presence. I think that's a key part of it.
Okay, I have a few questions on the fire issue, but let me just ask you now. Do you acknowledge that there is a sixth extinction and that it is the result of the collective actions of human beings?
Absolutely.
Okay. In my view, there is no human-managed landscape on Earth that can equal the complexity and beauty of a wilderness environment. Our activities may increase the presence of some species in a given area, but always with a net loss of biodiversity over the long run. What about a little humility instead of the hubris that humans can and should manage almost everywhere?
I guess I agree with that in a philosophical sense, but I don't think it gets beyond philosophy. I mean, we've been operating as a movement with that general belief for, half a century or more. And I don't know that it served us or nature well. People exist on these landscapes. And if you can reach 80% of your objective working with the people who are there, I think that's how we get a lot farther than trying to get to the 100% goal of kicking people out and finding that we lose the next election and get thrown backwards politically.
Okay. As I mentioned, you describe yourself as a supporter of wilderness, but it seems, if I understand you correctly, that you want to manage wilderness areas more than the 1964 Wilderness Act allows. What do you want to do inside wilderness areas other than set fires?
Just that. There are places where wilderness includes dry forests that aren't healthy because of fire exclusion and poor management from the past. There are places that I support, one-time use of chainsaws. Whether or not you would remove the logs, I don't, probably not. But in order to protect large trees, old forest structure, from the fire threat associated with the small trees that have grown around them, there's places where that type of active restoration would improve the biodiversity of a designated wilderness area. But on an ongoing basis, those places that have co-evolved with fire should have fire. And because we've excluded it for a long time, we've got to remedy that.
Okay,
Not in
and I
all
got
places.
that. I got that from your book. But what I would like to know, because you do mention thinning, what I would like to know is, would this thinning involve the use of roads and machines?
It can't involve roads. I mean, roads, thinning is hard, mainly because of the roads issue. Indians thinned with fire at a landscape level. And the land use patterns and the residential patterns, the villages in those pre-colonial times allowed, for fire to be wild. It's much harder these days. And boy, you want your restoration to be a net benefit to the landscape. And if you build a road into access to enable the restoration thin, you've probably done more harm than good. As for machines, some machines are better than others. The Wilderness Act has a purity standard, right? You need special exemptions to use a chainsaw to clear a trail after a wind event. Maybe that's all right. Maybe it's not for low priority things like trail clearing. But I worry a lot about old forests in wild areas. And there are places that I think we need to thin. And if we can do it without roads, but if a chainsaw helps, I'd be open to that.
But not roads. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yes. Road. I'm not a fan of roads, if that's the key question.
Okay. I would like to read a couple of sentences from your book that I find misleading. Okay. You say, quote, "Old forests depend on Indian fires to remain healthy and natural," end quote. And then another part of your book, you say, quote, "What kept the land in ecological health was fire, much of it set by Indians," end quote. These two sentences imply that it was human activities that were responsible for the health of the land, when in fact the land was healthy without any human activities in the first place. The health of the forest in the land does not and never has depended on human activities, including the use of fire by Indians.
Disagree with your statement, Glenn. I mean, there's good evidence now that around 12,000 years ago, contemporaneous to the spread of the increase of human colonization that, came as the glaciers retreated and the climate started to moderate after, the Ice Age. That there were massive, massive, massive amounts of fire that didn't precede this era. So the hypothesis is that those indigenous people discovered the benefits of fire and how to apply it to the land. And that must have been unbelievably traumatic. The Pleistocene wildlife, North America 15,000 years ago was not a place of gray wolves, grizzly bears, elk, deer, and moose. It was a place of dire wolves and cave bears and camels and horses and sloths and a bunch of other Pleistocene fauna that are gone. And they're gone probably driven extinct by human activity, whether direct hunting or those fires. There's all sorts of arguments. We don't really know. So that was not a great episode for biodiversity. However, that was 12,000 years ago. And that relationship with the land, that human perpetuation of fire, continued for 12 millennia. It changed how those ecosystems function so that today's biodiversity is correlated with that type of human relationship to the land. We hurt biodiversity when we exclude that type of, level of fire.
But before the arrival of human beings, the land was healthy. So the health of the land does not depend in the way you suggest. That's why I say these comments are misleading to me. It doesn't depend on human activities, including Indian fire, because take away all those activities, go back before 12,000 years, the land was healthy.
Sure. But how do you go back 12,000 years? We have the conditions now that co-evolved over the last 12 millennia. We can't ignore those conditions. We can't pretend that, that those changes didn't occur.
All right. But so here's my response to that. If we disrupt or cease human activities by setting aside large wilderness areas, then this will not diminish or harm biodiversity in the long run. Right?
If we allow
the land to return to
pre-colonial level of fire to continue in those areas, there are other human, we're kind of simplifying it. How when we talk about the value that grizzly bears have to landscapes, when we talk about wolves and their ecological impact, we'll often talk about trophic cascade, right? Keystone species theory, that if you remove a top carnivore like wolves, you release the mesocarnivores, the coyotes and other mid-level carnivores, and it has ripple effects through the ecosystem. It changes the abundance of deer and elk and moose, and it impacts the distribution of willow and aspen and other vegetation. That's how we talk about wolves. And then somebody says, but what about grizzly bears? What benefits do they have to the land? And then we get kind of micro. We say, well, they claw up they're digging around for roots and forbs in the alpine, and they're digging up termite and ant nests, and that tills the soils and it has benefits. And they also, they they pull salmon out of the stream and they poop out those proteins up in the forest. And that's all true, but it's not true at the same scale as when we talk about keystone species like wolves or sea otters and kelp and sea urchins. It's a different thing. And I think you could make similar arguments for those pre-colonial levels of human engagement. There was a lot of, food and medicinal plant, cultivation and digging, things like that. So people were active on the landscape. In our first episode, you and I had a little disagreement over the extent of human population and presence. And I argue that, the people were well distributed and fairly abundant in a lot of places, which means that they were having impacts on the land, probably like grizzly bears were in certain types of areas. And that went on for a long enough time that it becomes part of that ecological process. It affects biodiversity.
Okay, but, after our last conversation, I went to Google and I went to chat. I know they're not the complete answer, but they can provide some good information. And according to both of them, there was only, we're talking the North American pre-Columbian landscape, there was only about 5 million people. I
don't think those are correct. It's actively debated, and I don't remember the numbers, but there's,
You disagree with that?
I think, Google or chat are probably digging up decades of older presumptions, and the newer stuff challenges that.
Let me read this one sentence to you. You may agree with this. I don't know, so that's why I'm reading it to you. This is from Google. When I asked the question, what percentage of the landmass of pre-Columbian North America was wilderness? This is the answer. Quote, it provided. Only 10% of the total landmass was under direct human use, such as farming and other modifications. The vast majority of the continent remained in a natural state with nomadic hunting and gathering activities only slightly impacting large portions of it. Do you disagree with that description?
Probably not, with the exception of fire. And I gave the fire statistics in the book. There's, a lot of new research on the extent of Indian fire, and I'll throw this out there again. What we would consider our worst fire years in the American West these days, the real heavy fire years in the last decade or two, were only about 10% of the total acreage of what we now think burned on average every year in pre-colonial times.
Okay, you moving on so we can get to the second part of the interview. You seem to be arguing in your book that environmentalists overestimate the value of wilderness, if I understand you correctly. You say in your book, quote, there has been much progress for large carnivores, end quote. But that's just not true. And the reason it's not true, I believe, is because we have lost so much of our wilderness. I am trying to understand why you, a person who obviously cares a lot about wildlife, would want to weaken the link between wildlife, especially apex predators, and large wilderness areas.
We'll make the argument, Glenn. I mean, wolves don't need wilderness. Wolves are generalists. They can live anywhere. Well, not anywhere, but they're highly adaptive, highly fecund. Mm-hmm. And so long as you're not shooting or poisoning or trapping them, they're going to do just fine. grizzly bears. Grizzly bears were more a plains species than a montane species prior to, the European colonization. We drove or limited grizzly bears to the mountain wilderness. And now as their numbers are increasing in the northern Rockies and northern Continental Divide, they're spreading back out to the plains, which is, challenging. They're out where the farms and the livestock are. Lynx and wolverine, they're going to be in the wild areas because they need high elevations. They den in snow, north-facing slopes for wolverine. Wolverines don't like people around. It's different for every critter. But, oh, goodness. Fishers, martins, what they need is forest structure. They don't care if there's people around.
So you asked me to make the argument, but my answer to that is I'm relying on a key concept in the field of conservation biology, which is the idea of wilderness-dependent species. So are you questioning that concept in your book?
Yeah, because I think we're seeing carnivores return and recover in general and not correlated to, if you consider wilderness the presence, absence of people, the wilder, more rugged areas, that's not ideal wolf habitat. It's great for wolverines. You can argue about wolverines. But for a lot of wildlife, I think it's hard to say that wilderness is what the critters need.
Okay, but you're certainly going against the in my opinion anyhow, one of the key concepts of the field of conservation biology. But let me ask you two more questions on this, then we'll go on to part two. Now, you mentioned wolverines, and you mentioned this last time, and you said that someone saw a wolverine near a pizza parlor. I believe that's what you said. So my question to you would be, does a wolverine belong near a pizza parlor or in the wilderness?
Well, 5 years ago, I would have said wolverines are more associated with classic ideas of wilderness than any other critter. Wolverines hate people. You're only going to find them on top of the mountain. And then we ended up with wolverines, photographed near a pizza parlor in Westport, Washington. I think a similar thing. I think one was photographed in downtown Corvallis, Oregon. And then another one, or maybe the same one, who knows, eating a dead seal on a beach on the Washington coast, a long way from anything we would have thought of as wolverine habitat. I mean, critters roam. Critters disperse at certain times of their lives. Young ones trying to find a territory of their own, or, following scents. They can, I smell something dead 10 miles away over in that direction. I'm going to go. Yeah, so that's not ideal habitat. No one would argue that you're going to have a sustainable wolverine presence or population.
Well, that's the point, though, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about lone individuals, but they can't live in an area where there's a pizza parlor. In order for there to be a wild wolverine anywhere, there has to be a viable population of wild wolverines somewhere. Isn't that a cardinal tenet of conservation biology?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So let's go on to part two on your indirect strategy. I think it goes too far when you say that zero cut on public lands or zero cut, no grazing on public lands has the, and I quote you on this, net effect of engendering more entrenched opposition from timber and beef industries. In end quote. I believe it is naive to think that you can reach lasting, trusting, and honorable agreements with those who are killing planet Earth for profit. Your book downplays the role of the big cattle and agricultural interests. Do you want to respond to that? Well, I was just, I'm saying.
I'm saying that I don't find, I think you're getting a little binary, that there's evil people out there and we need to oppose them or end them. And I don't find that. I find common ground. We've had a lot of success working with people across the political spectrum, including some recalcitrant, belligerent John Bircher ranchers that other, wildlife activists, threaten with death. And we found that we can work with those people, and they're doing a good job or putting real effort into trying to live with wolves.
Yeah, I understand that point, but what I'm pointing out is the bigger corporate interests behind the cattle and agricultural interests.
Yeah.
Do you think that you could reach trusting and lasting and honorable agreement with them?
Oh, it's hard to be black and white about it. I don't think you can have honorable, trusting relationships with sociopaths. And, a certain percentage of people are sociopaths. And I think some corporations behave with sociopathic ways, where the only thing that matters is, quarterly profits. Some, not all. But the generalization breaks down to what extent are the timber and ag interests that you're most concerned about, Glenn, that are engaging on public lands or rich habitats. Just how corporate are they? A lot of the sawmills are smaller, family-owned. It's easier to work with them in general, I think, than the Boise Cascades or other big corporate ones. That said, we're working with Weyerhaeuser on a critical easement in a habitat corridor in western Washington, working really well with them. We fight vigorously over forest practices rules, but, it's hard to generalize.
Okay.
Corporate, the corporate engagement with cattle, a lot of the, people don't like the permittees on public lands, the ranchers that have allotments. But those are almost all just individuals. They're families with base ranches. And they sell their cattle to middlemen who are corporate and are rapacious and harm those people. Take advantage of them. Take advantage of the ranchers. So there are instances in which we can find common ground with ranchers or loggers against corporate behavior.
So you ask in your book, and this is a quote, you say this: do wolf advocates know what life can be like in wolf country? Do they care? End quote. I ask you, do ranchers know that wolves have an intrinsic right to live in their homelands free from human harassment and persecution? Do they care?
Some do, some don't, but I'm more concerned about the behavior than the attitude. If we can get ranchers to realize that wolves are here to stay and their best way to engage is through techniques that reduce conflict. And if they do that work, I'm delighted. And I want to help those ranchers. And what upsets me is the type of wolf advocate that's not satisfied by that, and will scream and yell when the state goes to occasionally kill a wolf, as is sometimes necessary in order to maintain, keep recovery on track, to keep the population healthy.
Okay. So I do not agree with your goal, and I quote you here, that we can balance the future of spotted owls with that of the region's timber towns, end quote. Any more than I agree that we can balance grazing on public lands with healthy and happy wolves. Such a worldview is a fantasy, in my opinion. It's actually very impractical and unrealistic, in my view.
But we've done it. We're doing it. I mean, all right, so Glenn, maybe your vision, your perfect world 30 years from now, if everything went great, would have 50% of the land in wilderness, strict classic view of wilderness, and then people doing their thing on the other 50%. Let's separate it east and west, or up or down or something.
Yes.
My perfect landscape is very different. It's got, core habitats sprinkled around with corridors and highway crossings between them. And, there's more people spread around, but engaging with the land in ways that are acceptable, and in some ways even beneficial.
Okay, well, let me continue this a little bit. I think we do need healthy rural communities, but I don't think we need healthy rural communities based on grazing on public land, for example. Advanced science and technologies are changing societies, and human beings must and should accept these changes so that wolves and many other wild animals can survive and prosper. In other words, it's humans who must change, not wolves. I'll stop there and give you an opportunity to comment on that part if you like.
There's a new book out, We're Eating the Earth, I think it's called, by Michael Grumwald, who's a climate journalist. And he argues that, for climate purposes, we need the most efficient possible food systems. And he would say that he would agree with you that, livestock on top of the mountain is crazy. We need livestock penned up, and we shouldn't have free-range chicken and free-range beef, that those are inefficient and lead to, more land being in climate uses. Maybe, I think in broad strokes that's true. but I the broad strokes don't apply everywhere. There's a lot of people that want free-range beef and can figure out, and where they're going to get it is from public lands, because they don't want to eat beef that's raised in feedlots.
And what is that, 2%? You know that's only 2%.
Yeah, I do know that. But I also know that if you lose those public land ranchers, you're probably also going to lose their base ranches, which are the alfalfa fields right next to town that soon are growing houses instead of wildlife. It's not so black and white. Moreover, it's an academic argument. Those people are there. And for 50 years, we've been vilifying them and arguing they shouldn't be there, and we've made no progress. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, if we go to work with them, we can have wolves on the landscape. And you reach other conservation objectives. And we can find that we have things in common with them. And this rural-urban divide is destroying the country. Rural areas are heavily MAGA. And why wouldn't they be, the way we've demonized them? We're all Americans. Mm-hmm. We've got things in common. We've got to find ways to, show a little grace.
So, just so you know, I believe that we need government programs and money that enable rural economies to transition to eco-friendly ways of life. Maybe ecotourism, which has been a lot of that up in the Northwest economy where you live. So my point is this. Everyone, as you point out, every American has an inherent right to a dignified lifestyle. There's no question about that. But if the government provides rural ranchers who are grazing on public lands with new ways of living, and some people tenaciously cling to environmentally harmful economic activities, then that's the position I don't have a lot of sympathy for. If your livelihood is harmful to the earth and you refuse to change, even if you are offered a dignified alternative, then that's the problem.
There's a hell of a lot of people that are living in giant houses and whose, urban lifestyles, where they make their money off of, wholly unsustainable practices. Mm-hmm. Probably much less sustainable than a rancher lifestyle. I mean, it's hard to compare. I mean, carbon footprints in town are smaller than in rural areas, or towns are more efficient, I believe, in dense urban living. My point, though, is you can't say that the bad people are the ranchers and the loggers. There's a lot of people doing a lot of wasteful, harmful things elsewhere too, and we're all trying to get along. All of us have our impacts, and I think we do a little better if we're a little more open-minded and collaborative about it.
I agree with that. So we only have about 4 minutes, and I want to get to, in some ways, the main difference between us. So I understand your passion and confidence that by using collaborative methods, you can fix things, that you can do positive things. But the chief problem I have with your book is that what you regard as, and I quote you, wildly successful is far short of what many others, myself included, regard as wildly successful. So, to be more concrete, many of us do not regard it as wildly successful that wolves, fishers, lynx, wolverines live in a semi-wild ranching country, or what's called middle landscapes, patchworks of fringe agricultural areas. We want wild lives in wild places. Do you get that?
Yeah. And if it's a culture war, you know, that creates an antagonistic relationship with the people who, you know, make their livings in those middle landscapes. I think you're going to do less for wildlife than you want to. You know, it's one thing. Mm-hmm. It's holding the perfect against the good. This notion that we can alienate people in that way. I think we just need to be more pragmatic.
So I would say this to you. You are not going to influence the environmental community, assuming this is what you want to do. Not the environmental community rooted in the work of John Muir, Aldo Leopold, David Brower, and Dave Foreman, if you don't understand the end we seek. A couple of hundred wolves running around the state of Oregon and the state of Washington is not wildly successful. I don't see how your indirect strategy is going to get us to where we want to go. It's a very minimal threshold of success for which everyone is grateful. But do you worry that your indirect strategy succeeds in accomplishing just too little?
Well, of course. But I worry more that the direct strategies succeed even less. That's what I've seen, right? Mm-hmm. 40 years ago, we were all deep ecologists, and we thought there was going to have to be a revolution, you know, and that we'd all, you know, that future people were going to be more sustainable in their philosophy and lifestyle, or we'd all be gone. It hasn't played out that way. And I don't think it will play out that way.
Okay, well, we're out of time. So thank you, Mitch, for a frank, interesting, and relevant conversation. Hopefully our different perspectives on some fundamental issues will enlighten others or at least give people something to think about.
Thanks, Glenn. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah,
I hope people read the book.
You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations with my guest, Mitch Friedman, on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have any comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org. Please include a phone number.